if you need to be profitable on second or third purchase, it's such a high risk model, particularly due to the cost of capital. Because if you're not making profit on first order, if your LTV to CAC is below 1, you need to self-liquidate that customer acquisition from somewhere. And so that's either going to be in investors, which majority of brands don't have investors in early stage startups. And so that's sort of like 1% of brands. And then it's you need to self-fund or you need to get loans. And then what is the cost of capital on loans and then self-funding? And then what is the degree of risk that you are going to self-liquidate profitability on second purchase? It's such a risky model to run. The only people that should really be running it, 15-year ecom veterans. People that really know their numbers and they can watch everything on a day-to-day basis. They know everything down to the cent. They can reduce the risk in that kind of model.
Welcome to eCommerce Australia. I'm your host, Ryan Martin, founder of Remarkable Digital, an e-commerce SEO agency. This episode, I'm joined by a previous guest, Nathan Perdriau, co-founder of Blue Sense Digital, paid performance marketing specialist, absolute elite agency. Got a lot out of their last podcast, so we had some fantastic feedback on board. Met the guys at the recent retail fest on the Gold Coast, and got dwarfed by them. They're both about a foot taller than me, and met the what would you call him? The character of the group in Anthony as well. Yeah. So, mate, looking forward to having another chat with you and learning some more great insights around ecom.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
No problems. So, mate, how are things at Blue Sense Digital? Firstly, how's 2024 been?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. It hasn't been, at least on the agency side, it hasn't been like what we might be seeing on ecom with the pullback in revenue. We're still seeing a lot of clients coming on board. Clients are doing pretty well across the board as well. I think the fact that times are getting a bit tough at the moment, particularly over the last 6 to 8 weeks, I think it's actually a really good opportunity for us because it's where you can start to shine because you have to have more of a technical ability and know what you're actually doing. Whereas if you're just trying to put some ads together and run a digital marketing service, it's a tough time to do that.
Yeah. Are you finding that? Like, are you noticing from some of your clients, are they down a little bit in revenue? Is the AOV down? Like, how would you sort of generally sum up the year across your client suites, but even the ones that aren't clients that you speak to that don't come on board? What are your findings so far?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit biased because majority of the clients that we work with are in rapid growth at the moment. And so the majority of our client portfolio isn't $100 million brands that have tapped out. And now when you hit a recession, they're the ones that are going to get pulled back. We're working with these like $2 to $10 million brands who are rapidly scaling because they have product market fit and they have their marketing dialed in. And so 60 to 70% of our clients are up year on year by like 20 to 40%.
Okay.
And so I could look at that and say everything's all good.
Yeah.
Everyone's doing well. But then the larger ones that are at the top end, they're seeing the pullback. And so it's those that have sort of gotten close to the total addressable market, or they are out the other end of their growth peak to where they're seeing a pullback. And then all of their shipping logistics providers are giving them supposedly information that everything's down across the board. So apparently the actual shipping providers are seeing pullbacks.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I see clients in two buckets. Some of the pullback is more around that average order value. So I mentioned I've got a couple of florists, and they're not huge. They're not doing multi-million-dollar e-com stores, but it's just interesting to kind of note, looking at the AOV across Mother's Day, it was down a little bit, same amount of orders, but people aren't spending as much on some of those things.
Yeah.
But across the board, I think since the pandemic, we've been lucky in that pandemic. Obviously, the e-commerce was the only thing open, especially in Melbourne. But as we start to come out of it now, the brands that are doing well are doing those 1%ers right or 2%ers right. They're not skimping on understanding their customer better, and they just have good hygiene. For sure. I know Brendan Gillen talks about e-commerce hygiene a lot, and it rings true. The brands that are doing those 1%ers right, that are actually listening to their customers, that are investing where they need to across their numbers, which I know you guys are really strong about as well. They're the brands that continue to fire.
For sure. I think even on that average order value point, there's like if average order value is pulling back on majority of brands, which is typically what happens if you go into a recession and there's a pullback in spending, because people still want to buy, but they don't want to spend as much. They'll take the less premium product over the higher one, or they'll put less items in cart. They'll buy one instead of two. The brands that better understand e-commerce analytics at a deeper level on all of those metrics, I think they're the ones that will actually shine. And I also think that they're the agencies that will do well. And like on average order value, pull me out here if I'm about to go way too deep, because I could talk about like any metric for 20 minutes.
Yep.
But any metric in the back end of Shopify sort of tells you nothing, because you don't see the data that's being used to aggregate the metric at a top level. And so you can't infer any decision making that's actually going to swing that metric in the right direction. And so on average order value derives down to new customer average order value and then returning.
Yes.
And so they're two very, very different audiences with two different buying behaviors. Generally speaking, returning customers will spend more because they've experienced the brand. That's why they came back.
Yeah.
And so they're willing to buy two or buy three or buy the higher end product. Whereas mostly when we're talking about increasing average order value, we're talking about increasing first time customer average order value. And then you can derive that down further and you can go into, well, what does the cohort look like over that pricing range? Because most people have an $80 average order value, but the average order value isn't $80. They have a peak at 40 and they have a peak at 120. And so if you're trying to move the 80, you're trying to move people that don't even exist. No one's buying at 80. Everyone's buying at 40 and everyone's buying at 120. And so you need to move one of these two. And what you'll end up finding, and we've done this with clients where they have an $80 average order value, we'll set the free shipping threshold at 60. Average order value will go up to 100. It's like, how does that make sense? We set a threshold to deprioritize people down, but it's because we moved that $40 peak and we moved it up to 60 to 70.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And then you can keep going deeper and you can go, how do you even make average order value? And average order value is average unit retail times units per transaction plus 1 minus return rates plus 1 minus discount rates plus shipping collected. And so if you start to look at the 5 levers that underpin average order value, you can take out shipping collected, you can take out returns, you can take out discounts. You don't really have much control over it as an operator. You have a little bit of control. And then you've got units per transaction. So that's how many items are in your cart. And then you have average unit retail, which is average price of a product.
Yeah.
And so they're your 2 levers. And so if a brand is looking at the average order value number and they're going, this is going down because we're going into a recession, how do we improve it? It's not how do we make a decision based off that $80. It's firstly, where do the cohort peaks sit on new customers? And then how do we increase either prices or units per transaction?
Yeah.
Mostly people can't increase prices because of the elasticity of demand, and most brands just don't want to even try it. They're like, I don't want to see what happens.
Yeah.
So you just need to be focusing on how can you get people to add more to cart.
Yeah.
And then you can go a step further and pull me out. But
no, mate, I love this. It's fantastic. So I think, as I said, there's some really great learnings there already around, AOV as a rule. It's something that I use quite a bit just to as a generalization. But yeah, it's interesting to know the next level down. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you can do that with every metric, but there's also looking at the customer database and the skew across units per transaction. And so this is a really common mistake. I imagine some people listening right now will get value out of this point, which is if let's say you have an average UPT of 1.3. So on average, a customer has 1.3 items in their cart.
Yep.
And you're thinking, okay, if we can bump that up to 1.5 or 1.6, our average order value will go up 20%. So that's what we now need to focus on after listening to Nathan ramble for the last 5 minutes about why we need to do that.
No, I love it.
And so then they go into their website, they go to their marketing team and they say, how do we incentivize people to spend 1.5? But that's, once again, you're looking at the wrong thing and you're optimizing for the wrong thing. Because to get you from 1.3 to 1.5, the hardest way to do that is to get majority of people to buy 2 items. The easiest way to do it is look at the top 10% of spenders who are already going to spend a ton with you. They have high disposable incomes. They either love your brand, they love your particular industry, and get them to buy 6. And so now if you can just move the top 10% of people and give them the option to buy 5 or 6, it'll skew your UPT up. And that's where you'll see outsized returns.
Yeah.
Most people don't have their discoverability, they don't have their website, they don't have their offers structured in a way that even enables people to spend that much. If I went to an average like website and I said, could I add 5 things to cart and would that make logical sense? The answer is probably no.
Yeah.
And so it's how do I enable a customer experience to where they have the capability to buy 5 or 6 items.
Yeah.
Because if you enable that, then you're really leveraging that top 10 to 20% of customers. And that's where you can see a big move in the average mean, and your average order value will go up 20 to 30%.
Yeah, fantastic, mate. That is so good. One website that comes to mind, I was literally on it last night, was Culture Kings. I don't know, since we went to Retail Fest and I heard Simon Beard do the talk, the keynote presentation, and I was on his website last night because I wanted to see, he was talking very much about, in-store experience, and I wanted to see whether the website matched that, and it does. And I think that's one website that would absolutely be plugged into those sorts of, features to help get people to buy more and more. I added a couple of t-shirts to cart, and then it's like on the cart page, it's like spend an extra $30, and then it gets you to free shipping. And there's all these different ways that they're trying to bring up that AOV. So it's fascinating to hear that.
Yeah, they're super sophisticated, and I think that as demand goes down from consumers to buy online, this is a really good opportunity
to get smarter.
For people to get more sophisticated and get a really good understanding. It's even like in the fact that a lot of people optimize for increasing average order value, but average order value also, despite everything I just said, doesn't even matter. What really matters is contribution margin on first order.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you're trying to make money on the first order. You're not trying to just gain arbitrary revenue. And so what you can do as an exercise is you could take all orders, you could export it. You could then minus COGS on each individual order in a Google Sheet.
Yep.
You could then minus average shipping and fulfillment. And you would then get profit per order on every single order. And then what you can do is just do an equals sort and bucket all the orders into $10 orders, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100. And then look at what happens at your free shipping threshold. And what you'll end up seeing for most brands is that, let's say their free shipping threshold is at $100. At 90, they're making $30 profit per order. And then as it goes to 100, they're now making 28. And so they've incentivized people to spend more, but they're making less money because they now have given away the incurred shipping collected at checkout. And so is that a trade that anyone wants to make? Someone out there could argue that, no, it is a good trade because now there's more product in that person's hand. And if they have more product, then they're more likely to come back and purchase from us. And there's other people that are more likely to see that product in their house and then buy. But that is such like a high risky out there idea to be operating on. Like at the end of the day, it's just how much profit are we driving on first purchase?
Yeah.
And so the operators that as well that can understand contribution margin and profit at an order level are going to do really, really well over the next 1 to 2 years. And it's those that got away with just taking a product, marking up by 2 and trying to figure out how to sell it during COVID. They're the ones that their P&L is just going to get squeezed.
Yeah. And so would that be the same even if you've got a subscription model or consumables? Would you still offer that same advice to, obviously look at contribution margin, which I'm sure you would offer that same advice to, but can they take more of a risk in terms of offering that free shipping threshold at $100, knowing that they've got a subscription model, they can pay a little bit more to get a recurring customer through? Or is your advice and take, I probably know where you're going to go with it, still you don't want to be losing money at any stage?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you asked me this 12 months ago, in fact, if you asked me it on the last podcast, I would have said CPG brands are the best brands to run because you have repeat purchase rates that are really high. And so you make a lot of money on second and third purchase. There's a lot more nuance and intricacies in the business model of CPG brands and repeat purchase rates that I didn't know at the time or understand, that now I think I have a bit of a better understanding of. And that's that if you need to be profitable on second or third purchase, it's such a high risk model, particularly due to the cost of capital. Because if you're not making profit on first order, if your LTV to CAC is below 1, you need to self-liquidate that customer acquisition from somewhere. And so that's either going to be in investors, which majority of brands don't have investors in early stage startups. And so that's sort of like 1% of brands. And then it's you need to self-fund or you need to get loans. And then what is the cost of capital on loans and then self-funding? And then what is the degree of risk that you are going to self-liquidate profitability on second purchase, it's such a risky model to run that the only people that should really be running it are 15-year ecom veterans.
Yeah.
It's people that really know their numbers and they can watch everything on a day-to-day basis. They know everything down to the cent.
Yeah.
And so they can reduce the risk in that kind of model. But how many brands do you think during COVID came out that were consumable products in supplements and like beauty products? Like thousands.
It'd be a lot,
like thousands.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And then the question off the back of that is, of all of those business owners that started those brands, how many of them had experience in e-commerce analytics and financial operations prior?
Yeah.
Like none.
Yeah.
And that's why all of them to this day still do 5 to 10K a month in rev. Because how dialed in you have to be on financial operations and just understanding e-com analytics and how to structure offers profitably so that you can be profitable on first purchase or how to be profitable on second purchase. It's just, you're trying to learn so much for such a hard model to go down, when it's like you could just sell a $500 chair, have $400 margin, and now you got a lot more to play with. Now you just have to figure out, how do I spend $400 on Facebook to get a customer and I'll still break even?
Yep.
But instead you're trying to sell a $50 supplement where you have $16 of margin after shipping costs, after fulfillment cost, after transaction fees. And it's, how do you sell a supplement for $16?
Yeah. It's pretty competitive in that market as well.
Yeah. So you've started in the toughest e-com business model that you could possibly start in.
Yep. Yeah, and they don't have, obviously, if it's just a startup, they don't have the capital, or generally don't have the capital to invest in brand over a long period of time to get, some efficiencies of scale around that as well. So let's bring it back a step then. In terms of, you mentioned off the top that Shopify Analytics are rubbish. What should the audience that are listening to this podcast then, what should they do about it? It's okay to sort of can it. What's the solution then for them? Is it do you look at GA4? Do you export all of that and then run your own analytics through it? How do you suggest that they approach their measurements?
Yeah, it's a good question. The first thing is, Shopify Analytics is the best out of all of the website platforms. So even though it is not as helpful as you probably think it is, it's better than the other. And if you're on a different website hosting platform for ecom, your analytics are even worse. So you better be on Shopify as like a starting point. But the really good thing about Shopify is their ability to aggregate reports and then export them. So we do a lot of report exporting, and then we have our own consulting models that we've built out in Google Sheets, where we can track, and it's pretty insane the level of detail that we've gone to here, but I think it's immensely valuable for having these deeper insights, which is, we track month-on-month unit economics. So most brands average. People love averages. I hate averages. Yeah. They're not useful. That's why I hate average order value. That's why LTV, I hate, these are all just averages with no specifics constraints put on them. And so unit economics change month on month because discounts change month on month, because individual product SKUs change month on month, and they all have different COGS. And so we track gross margin month on month. We track lifetime contribution margin across cohorts month on month. And so we can see, okay, over the last 6 months, what was our first order contribution margin? How much did we pay on CAC to acquire a customer? So we can see how profitable all of these audiences are. Yeah. And then we can go back and say, okay, in August, we had an incredibly profitable month where our 90-day LTV to CAC was a 4. Okay, what did we do there? How can we hone in on that? What was in the retention strategy? Oh, it was because we ran a discount. Should we try that again? And then we do this pretty much across every single metric. So AOV, and you can build these rudimentary versions of these models just by, for example, with an AOV cohort distribution, just export all your orders and then just do a pivot table, auto sort, and then just graph it. And then you can see the graph. With unit economics, that's a little bit more difficult. But the difference between first time and returning is really important. A lot of people don't consider how different a first time customer is to a returning customer. And because they average it, all of their KPIs are wrong, all of them. Yeah. Because a returning customer has significantly different UPT, which is what we talked about earlier. They'll generally put more items in cart. Yeah. But also discount rates will generally be much, much higher. And so when you look at first time unit economics versus returning, you'll end up seeing that on returning, average discount rate is like 30%.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that brands love to get customers back through just sending discounts and emails and sending discounts and emails. And then what they don't realize as a subset of that is that when you're looking at lifetime value, which is something that a lot of people like talking about now because of the rise of CPG brands,
yeah,
you see $200 in lifetime value, $100 AOV. And so you go, okay, so on average, we're acquiring a customer. They spend $100 on first purchase, which is incorrect because you're not breaking it down correctly.
Yeah.
But then the lifetime value is 200. So we can probably spend a little bit more to acquire a customer. And that's, I think, the line of thinking that a lot of e-com operators and agencies are going down. But all of that is wrong because your lifetime value, that extra $100 that you unlocked, you were discounting at a 30% rate. And if you have 40% gross margins, you just took 75% of the margin out of it. And so that extra $100 wasn't an extra $40 of profit. It was an extra $10 of profit or an extra $15 of profit.
Yeah.
And so you really unlocked almost no profit on the back end.
For a returning customer.
Not to mention, how much did it cost you to send all the emails? Like, were you using an agency that was costing $500 to $600 an email? Did you have an in-person person doing that? And then off the back of all of that, most people these days structure their Google and Facebook ad accounts in a way where 30 to 40% of their budget is just going towards existing customers anyway.
Yeah.
And so you take that CAC into consideration too, and you made no money. Yeah, you had $200 LTV, but there was no profit on the LTV. And so now when your agency or you as an e-com operator see these two numbers and you go, okay, we should just spend more on acquisition, go and spend more, your P&L drops to negative next month.
Yeah.
And you wonder why. I was baselining on these two metrics that I thought I understood, but there were all these layers underneath that unless you had the intricate details of them, you wouldn't have been able to make an educated decision as to like what next step to take.
Yep. Yeah, brilliant. I love it, mate. It's so good. So is that why you're starting to, with your clients now, I seen I think it was a LinkedIn post the other day you posted around, basically just working with clients on a P&L level as opposed to sort of analytics. And then what does that sales process look like in terms of like when you're onboarding a new client or you're pitching to a new client? You've obviously need to uncover, the more details you can, the better, but will they give you access to their P&L at that point in time? Or how do you kind of, what's the conversation like, just out of interest, in terms of sort of bringing them on board and getting them to a point where they can sign on and you can sort of, I guess most accurately forecast, results or where they're going wrong?
Yeah, that's a good question. Starting at the audit level, we took all the consulting models that we built and we now build them into our audit process.
Yeah.
And it takes ages. So long. I end up spending like 3 hours on audits these days. But
is it a paid audit? Do you do paid audits?
No, they're free.
Okay.
Yeah, they're free. And so we
a bit of value in that, mate.
Oh yeah, because I record a 1.5 hour video over our consulting models and our free audits.
Yeah, wow.
And I point out stuff that they would have never known because I'm pulling out all the stuff that we just talked about. First time order economics, returning customer order economics. And the reason why we do it isn't to increase our close rate, even though, of course, our close rate is through the roof because of how much value we provide up front. But the reason why we do it is so that we don't take on the wrong clients.
Yeah, I think that's important, right? For any agency or for any client that's looking to bring on board an agency, is there are certain agencies for certain types of businesses and certain types of people.
Yeah.
And I don't know if perhaps you've learned that the hard way. I certainly did, bringing on a couple that I thought I could help and I thought I could change their ways and you just can't. So I think it's really important for both parties.
For sure. There's a lot of clients that I wouldn't have taken on now if I did the audits that we do now 12 months ago.
Yeah.
Because even just the basics of looking at, are they profitable on first purchase? Even that information alone, I would have seen the brand and gone, oh wow, they're losing $10 on first purchase. And they're suggesting that we should 2x spend next month. We're just going to 2x their losses.
Yeah.
But at the time, I wasn't looking all the way down to the P&L level, or I wasn't looking in this kind of detail. And so we were looking at the brand overall and going, well, historically, they did $600,000 a month in revenue. So yeah, we could probably get them there. We're better than the other agency.
Yeah. And
like, we probably are on paper, but we didn't understand like the level of detail in terms of the finances behind it. And so that's the reason why we build all of that into the audit process. But then when it comes to bringing a client on board and actually looking at the P&L, the funny thing is, and I don't think most prospects or clients realize this, but if you do a basic order export out of Shopify, you pretty much get the whole P&L except operating expenses.
Okay.
And so I can aggregate, and this is why it's funny, is because in an audit video, I'll start the audit with, so anyway, this is your P&L, and I can see last month you did $3,000 in profit contribution, and they're watching it going, how does he know what? And my accountant hasn't even given me the P&L for last month, and how does he have it?
Yeah.
And it's because you can get all of the data because it's all there in Shopify.
Yeah.
The only thing missing is like how much you're spending on staff, warehousing, etc. And so I just make a base assumption based on the size of the business and put it in there.
Yeah.
And then once they come on board, we get the actual figures. So we request for your actual operating expenses so that we can build it into the model.
Yeah.
And then there's a few other numbers that we need to complete some of the models as well. But funnily enough, we don't really need Xero access or QuickBooks access. We have it for some clients. They just give us an invite and we're in there.
Yeah,
but
perfect.
It's not really necessary for us to get all the information that we need.
Yeah, it's so good though. Like to go to that level of detail, I don't think there's too many agencies that are doing that. So, credit to you. Yeah, no, it's fantastic.
Thanks.
So you want to touch on contribution margin, which we did touch on earlier around that, but it's something that I've learned a lot about. We had Carla Pencan on, who's in the beta testing. I'm not sure if you're plugged into that with Profit Peak, but I know a few people that are on that beta test at the moment and are pretty impressed with it all. Is that a takeaway tip that you can give e-commerce business owners, is to really know their contribution margin? Is that the metric? I know there's no one metric, but is that if they have one takeaway from this podcast, it's to know that they know their contribution margin. That's going to inform a lot of their decisions, and they can start to question either their own team or question their agencies on terms of actual profitability. Is that contribution margin kind of the metric?
Yes, probably.
Yes, but no, and it depends. Yeah.
I've done a lot of work with the Store Hero team, so very similar to Peak Profit, I believe it is.
Profit Peak.
Yeah,
not sponsored, but yeah.
They've got a similar SaaS product, which is that it essentially just goes down to the contribution margin level, and you can report on it on a daily basis. I think that is probably a good starting point to improve financial operations within an e-commerce brand. And I think it's also a really good North Star for a marketing team as well. And this is where I think marketing isn't where it should be across the board on the agency space, where the whole point, in fact, you could simplify the entire business. And this might be like a big statement, but this at least applies to e-com and the agency model, which is that business is, number one, how do I drive down CAC as low as possible? So the cost to acquire a customer. And then number two, which is the other side of the equation, how do I maximize contribution margin over the lifetime of each customer?
Yeah.
And then if that is bigger than that, you make money. Yeah. And if it's the other way around, you don't. And that's just how it all works. And so
we've got our takeaway clip right there.
And so if the marketing agency, if their whole role is keep CAC as low as possible, but they have no idea what the contribution margin is on the other side of the equation, how are they meant to know what they're doing? Because they could see, okay, CAC's at 20 and then we tripled spend. So there's always going to be an erosion in efficiency. And so maybe CAC goes to 30 and then they're like, okay, that's pretty good. Let's double spend again. And then CAC goes to 35 and they're like, well, that's pretty good as a baseline. But they're not looking at the other side of the equation, which is they only have $25 on each order. And so they're not making money.
Yeah.
And so as a marketing agency, as a e-commerce operator, looking at just that equation, which is exactly what all these SaaS products allow you to do, it's what you should be looking at, because it's just going to tell you, okay, how much money am I left with at the end of the day, every single day, and do I have enough of it to cover operating expenses?
Yeah.
And then it allows you to not overinflate operating expenses as well, which is what so many startup e-com brands do. I don't think it's even e-com. I think it's us. I think it's agencies. It's everything, which is that there's this ideology of you need to reinvest in the business. And people believe that reinvestment comes from reinvesting into operating expenses, when I think that is fundamentally the worst way that you could reinvest into a business, because operating expenses are so difficult to cut. And this is the funny thing, which is now that we get OpEx from clients, I was talking to someone the other day and they I think they said to me on a podcast, they went, oh, that's fantastic that you can now operate, you can look at operating expenses, because now you can look at clients and say, okay, just cut your operating expenses. And I said, I wish.
Yeah,
But like,
right.
what's the OPEX? It's
Yeah.
people and it's warehousing costs that are on lease terms of 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
How do I tell a client, yeah, just cut your lease that you've agreed to for 4 years, and yeah, just cut your staff, cut Sally, get her out.
Flick some people. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, you just can't. And so you need to be so careful. Anytime you're adding something to OPEX, you better be very, very sure that should be added to your P&L.
Yeah.
Because if it's not, then don't add it.
Yeah.
You want to be operating at the lowest percentage OPEX in total proportion to revenue as possible. Really, you shouldn't have OPEX above 20%. So if you're doing 100,000 in rev, OPEX shouldn't be above 20K.
Yeah.
At a max. Now, the thing is that operating expenses do democratize at scale in proportion to total revenue. And what I mean by that is, logically speaking, and people will always make this sell, is that as revenue increases, OPEX won't increase in proportion. It'll increase a lot slower. And so as a percentage, OPEX, maybe when you're a tiny brand, is 40%.
Yeah.
But then as you start to scale, it'll go down to 10. Most brands don't do that though.
Yeah.
They just keep increasing operating expenses linearly, because they are under the assumption that they should back operating expenses into future growth.
Yeah.
And so they're like, yeah, we're increasing linearly, but that's because we're going to have exponential growth later. Once again, like a super flawed assumption, because you're building in growth that doesn't exist. And I think building this was like a Jeff Bezos quote that I heard once, which I thought was great, which is that the life cycle of a company is based on how slow it takes them to get to their peak revenue. And so if it takes you 10 years to reach your peak, it will take 10 years for you to die off the back of that.
Okay.
If it takes you 1 year to reach your peak, you'll be gone in a year.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
And I think that was like a good metaphor for sustainable growth, and not just rapidly reinvesting in OPEX. Because if you do that, you'll be the brand that 1 year later, they're at 1% net profit, they drop 10% top line, and the whole business goes under.
Yeah. Have you made that mistake? Because I've made that mistake as well as an agency owner as well.
Yeah.
Is that a mistake you guys made or weren't aware of early days, or?
Yeah, you can probably tell I'm talking from personal experience.
Well, that's it, mate. Like, at the end of the day, like, you're fairly new to running your own business, as am I, and those are mistakes that are easy to make. I think people that have been in business a lot longer than us probably making them right now as well. Like, it's just, if you sit back and question some of those things, then it's bloody interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is with the agency model as well, it's way more cutthroat than e-commerce. And this is probably good context for any e-commerce brands listening as well, because I think it's important to understand the agency model.
Yeah.
To understand, number one, probably why there isn't that many good agencies.
Yeah.
But number two, if you're going to work with them, which I fundamentally believe that you have to work with agencies.
Yes.
If you're a business, because an agency is a conduit of the most up-to-date information within their specific domain. And so if you ever try to hire someone in-house, unless you're an enterprise brand and you have like 100 employees in that domain, you're never going to be up to date on the forefront. And so if your competitor works with a really competent agency, they will just beat you in that domain.
Yeah.
And so there's always going to be this relationship of client side with agency if you're growing rapidly. And so understanding how the agency works is important. And tying this back to what I was actually starting off with is that the agency business model works that there's no variable costs. In e-commerce, you have cost of goods sold, which based on accrual accounting, your cost of goods sold will change month on month if your revenue drops. If your revenue drops 50%, great, your COGS dropped 50% because you didn't have to fulfill as many orders. So what ends up happening is that if you're a healthy e-com brand, and we actually do this in the audit process, I have an analytical model that pulls their P&L and then showcases how much of a revenue dip could they take in top line before they start going into negative EBITDA.
Yeah.
And a really healthy e-com brand can drop 70% in top line revenue and still be profitable, which is crazy.
Okay, yeah.
That's a really good position to be in.
Yeah.
An agency, there's no variable cost, it's all fixed. So if an agency is operating at 20% net profit, which is a typical agency at scale, if you drop 20% on top line, you're negative EBITDA.
Yep.
And then all of the negative externalities from that start to arise, and you start to figure out why a lot of agencies are bad.
Yeah.
And so if a big agency right now dropped 20% on top line revenue, they dropped to 0%. what do? The solution is we need to sign more clients.
Yeah.
We have no money to hire more salespeople. So we can't hire more salespeople. What do? Well, we're already getting 1,000 leads a month. We turn 600 of them down because they're not good businesses and we shouldn't really work with them. Start signing them.
Yeah.
Start bringing them through the door. And so then they start bringing through all these clients through the door that aren't ICP. And then what happens? Churn goes up. Employee satisfaction goes down because now all of your employees are getting shouted at by businesses that you can't drive results for.
Yeah.
So now your employee churn goes up and you start losing employees. And then it's just this death spiral of every agency.
Yeah. I think I was listening to, as I mentioned, before we started recording, I listened to a previous Blues Brothers podcast episode of which you and Sebastian do and do a great job with it. I heard the analogy of that sort of taking on water, that leaking, the boat starts to leak, they take on more and more water, you get more and more drag. So it makes complete sense. I think that's a good takeaway that, you got to take the time to know the agency before you just sign up. And, agencies get such a bad rap, and maybe for good reason a lot of the time. But it's probably because they're not in that level of detail. And to get to that level of detail, they have to spend a bit more on an agency, I would imagine. I don't know what your prices are, but, you can go and get the cheapest quote out there for an agency, but it turns out to be the most expensive. And then you try 3 or 4 different cheap agencies and you go, none of them are any good. Well, so actually it's just because you haven't really taken the time to get to know that agency, know what they can do, know where they specialize in. And I think too, there's just a lot of generalist agencies out there, and which is why I've just focused on SEO and Google Ads. And why you guys are sort of focusing on paid is because there's just so many generalists out there and they get smoked by elite operators such as you guys in the market. So it's an interesting space. I've worked for, generalist marketing agencies and learning so much more on my own and just focusing on a couple of areas in particular.
Yeah, for sure. We could talk about this all day.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's helpful to e-commerce brands to understand that the different levels of agencies and some of the mistakes that, you see. And I'm quite happy to mention that I brought on a couple early days that, I thought I could help. I thought I could change their ways. I thought I could improve their website and their thinking. And sometimes you just can't.
Yeah.
And then they walk away. They've had a bad experience. I've had a bad experience. I'm frustrated. No one's singing anyone's praises, and it's not good for anyone. So, and no one wants to take on a client that they can't help, I think.
Yeah.
Well, certainly from my point of view anyway.
Yeah, well, it's different when the sales team is disconnected from the delivery team.
Yeah.
And I think that's where
that is spot on. That is spot on, yeah. Where, it's just sales and then you handball it over to the technical guys and the technical guys are like, fuck, we can't do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, what have you done here?
Yeah.
It's like, do your best.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. I think there's 2 truths, which is truth number 1, all e-commerce brands that scale quickly require at least some input from agency side.
Yeah.
Because as I said before, to get the highest degree of technical competence within a domain, that will usually only be found at an agency. And then the second core truth is the agency model is unbelievably difficult to scale. I think it's way harder to scale than ecom. As someone that's worked with over 250 e-commerce brands and scaled my own ecom brands, trying to scale an agency is so tough. I think it's doable. There's actually a few big agencies that do an incredible job. I would say that we're verging on probably medium size now, and I still think we do an incredible job. But there is just so much effort and internal systems that go into it. That scaling human resources, essentially scaling a service, requires consistent talent upskilling internally. So you need to be constantly disseminating learnings across the board. You need to be ensuring that everyone that you hire cares genuinely. And God, that is a difficult thing in itself.
That's hard, yeah. But I think if you look after people, they look after your people, I think is a Richard Branson quote. But, if you're hiring people on, and this is, agencies can be guilty of that as well, hiring on pretty low salaries, getting junior people in because it's less of a hard cost, then those people don't care as much. Whereas you look after them, you upskill them, you show them opportunities for growth, you actually teach them to be better at what they do. they're going to care more, and your clients are going to get better results as well.
Yeah, a client said this today. They actually dropped us a Google review this morning.
Nice.
And our Google reviews are always we send them into the internal winning chats to our team. So we try to get the client to mention any account managers and really shout them out. And the one thing that he said was Blue Sense truly feels like an example is being set from the top down.
Okay.
And I think that's probably true for small to medium-sized businesses, which is the example that is set at the top, or the way that the people at the top act disseminates down into the team. And I think this is, as someone that does not have kids and is going to say something wildly out of context for me, I'm going to say it anyway, which is I think that also cross-translates to parenting, which is that if you see rich parents with kids that treat people like shit, it's normally because when the family is at dinner at a restaurant, it's because the parents treat the staff like shit. And it's the parents that are rich that treat everyone with respect. The kids see that when they're growing up, and they infer that that's how people are, and then they treat people with respect. And I think that's the same in terms of organizational hierarchy, which is that the people at the top, the way that they act, will bleed down into the people under them.
Yep. I love that. Yeah, that's good, mate. There's a couple of good takeaways here from this podcast. A couple more questions before we wrap up. Last podcast, I mentioned, what do you think we'll be talking about in 12 months' time? Yeah. Do you remember what your answer was?
I think it was YouTube Shorts.
YouTube Shorts, yeah, 100%. So are you still bullish on YouTube Shorts as a channel? What are you thinking now? What do you think we'll talk about in the next 12 months' time, and what do you think about your previous prediction?
Yeah, in the next 12 months' time, I hope I'm more accurate than the last one.
Well, it's still a thing, right? It's still a thing.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm not sure what I said last time, so I might be repeating myself, but YouTube is an interesting one because particularly in e-commerce, because the days to conversion, the conversion cycle is very long.
Yeah.
And this comes down to attribution settings within platforms. So and people are going to argue with this. People get really angry when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is
let's do it.
Which is that Facebook attributes based on 7-day click. And so what that means for Facebook as a platform is that they can only claim a conversion if someone purchases within 7 days.
Yep.
And Facebook, in terms of big tech incentive structures, is that they want to attribute as much revenue as they possibly can. Because if they can attribute all of your revenue to the platform, they can maximize their own revenue, because you as an e-commerce operator is going to go, well, Facebook's driving all my revenue. We need to put more spend there.
Yep.
And so that's the easiest way to drive rev up. 7-day click, if that's the only way that Facebook can attribute, what they're going to do is just go after people that have fast buying cycles, that are going to buy within 7 days. Because there's no point in targeting Jimmy that on average it takes 25 days because he has to ask his wife and then he asks his kids and then he buys. Let's not target him. Let's target Nathan, because I know that he'll buy within 10 hours.
Yep.
And so when you end up launching on Facebook, even as a startup brand with $0 revenue, you just see revenue within like 24 hours. Launch on YouTube, you won't see a purchase for 20 days.
Yep.
And the reason being is that Google tracks users for all the way up to 90-day click windows. They have no rush. They don't have to get people over the line straight away. And YouTube as a platform as well heavily optimizes towards time on site. YouTube has the highest time on site out of any website in the world. And it's on, guess what it is? An average session on YouTube. And this is the average of every single person that goes on YouTube. How much time do they spend?
Oh, I would say, I don't know, 3 hours?
It's a lot lower. It's
okay.
Because you got to.
I'm thinking like screen time. Yeah. Okay.
It's.
I'll edit that bit out. Give me another. What's it close?
It's 20. I think it's like 24 minutes.
Okay. Yeah.
And so.
It wasn't far off.
Well, it's still crazy because even people. Imagine how many times you've gone on YouTube for 5 seconds and gone off.
Yep.
Average it all out, you still would have on average spent 25 minutes.
Yeah.
And so YouTube as a platform is heavily incentivized towards keeping people on platform rather than driving them off. And so that also ties into that consumer cycle. And so when you run a YouTube campaign, whether it's long or short, and I think like 6 months ago, I thought maybe it'll be different from shorts. Maybe people will interact differently, but they don't really.
Yeah.
People like staying on platform on YouTube. They're used to staying on platform. But I think that YouTube still is a really good driver of increases in marketing efficiency as a whole.
Yep.
And so anytime we've taken a client that's spending a decent amount, and you have to be spending a decent amount to really measure the statistical relevancy of this test, is introduce YouTube at a relatively low budget. Even just do retargeting. You can do cold as well, but start with retargeting. And what's your MER or your efficiency overall? You could look at contribution margin if you want, and you should see it improve.
Yeah. Okay.
It won't improve heaps, but it'll improve a bit because now you've got an extra touch point with all of those consumers.
Yeah.
And so you're more likely to push them down the line. And something that I don't think most people really think about, I don't hear people talking about it, is that because of these long buying cycles, because most people take 7, 13, 14 days to buy, it's not in getting the click. And this applies to Google Ads specifically as well. We have a lot of furniture clients and people don't buy a couch in 1 hour.
Yeah.
They go, I want a couch. And then they go to Google, they click on like 6 listings. They go, oh, I like that one, I like this one, I like this one. And then they think about it for 10 days. And every time they go into their living room, they go, yeah, I wouldn't mind a couch. And you know which of those 7 businesses ends up selling the couch to that consumer? The one that retargets the heaviest.
Yeah.
Because that person's forgotten about all the ones that didn't retarget them. And all they remember is the one that's now on their YouTube, that's now on their Facebook, that's now on their display, that's now on their Gmail ads. They're everywhere. And they go, okay, it's probably time that I buy that couch. And they click on that listing. And so people that are just driving off one-day clicks and trying to drive conversions, you're missing, well, all your competitors are just beating you.
Yeah.
Because they're staying on top of that consumer before they buy. So it's thinking about the whole entire customer journey, not just, hey, let's get traffic to site.
Yeah, yeah, spot on. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from Retail Fest as well. And my comment at the start of this podcast around brands that are doing those 1%ers well are winning, and the ones that aren't. So the ones that are just running Google Ads and trying to smash it and trying to get as much revenue and trying to get the clicks through are hurting because they're not doing the additional stuff. They're not doing that extra rep in the gym. They're not looking at what they eat from a diet point of view. And if we're talking about, athletes, same can be applied to e-commerce businesses, the ones that aren't actually nurturing the customer, and so you're spot on with what you say there. And, I'm in a similar position. I've got a furniture client as well and high-end purchases, but they just don't transact, on that first click. And sometimes when you're so far in that e-commerce business or that brand, you're like, why aren't they? And it's like, it's so easy as another great reason to use an agency. It's just because people don't click on the first couch they find and buy it, especially not it's a $5,000 couch.
Yeah.
No one, hardly anyone, I say no one, but hardly anyone will do that.
Yeah.
They want to go in, maybe they want to go into the showroom. And so, are there some lead gen campaigns that you can start to run to get people to book in so you can track it, get them, actually give them a good experience in store? And we're talking more sort of omni-channel than pure e-com, but it's cheaper to get an email address and a booking than it is to sell a couch. But there are a lot of ways, but I think that's the takeaway. One of the takeaways for me in this podcast is, again, just reiterating that you've got to do all of these little touch points well because your customer is human.
For sure. Yeah, it's not. In fact, the podcast that you were talking about previously that we did on our podcast with Carson, who did own the biggest Google Ads agency in the world. One thing that he pushes home a lot is that it's not one silver bullet, it's 100 golden BBs. And so it's getting the 100 1%ers right that makes you stand out. And everyone looks at you, whether you're an e-com operator or you're an e-com brand or you're an agency. And like you could almost look at BlueSense if you thought we were any good. And you could go, I wonder how they're so good. And I wish I could just, and we've tried, I wish I could just say, oh, that's why. Like it's one reason or it's 2 reasons. But at the end of the day, it's like 150 things that all make up tiny 1%ers. And in isolation, you look at it and you go, why does me understanding average order value even matter?
Yeah.
But then it's that with this, with that, and then it all adds together and compounds. And then you actually see, oh, okay, that's why they're in that position, or that's why that brand is in that position, and that's why we're not.
Yeah, 100%. Although it's always hard to kind of when you're so emotional into the brand, it's almost it's hard to be subjective sometimes. But that's why you need good partners.
Yeah, for sure.
Beautiful, mate. Thank you for the podcast. Some absolute great conversations, great takeaways. I'm sure we'll get some really good feedback from it.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
No worries.
Thanks, Ryan.
Cheers, mate.